From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Mark Nation. I'm Chief of Rare Books from across the way, and I'm very pleased to have you here today. Many of you know Jeanne Drewes, who's Chief of our Binding, Collection Care, and Mass Deacidification Division, which is part of the Preservation Directorate here at the Library of Congress. Jeanne and her staff are responsible for the care of the reference collections and the general collections here at the Library of Congress. Before she joined us in the hallways of the Library of Congress, she worked at Johns Hopkins and Michigan State University libraries. And both times she had an opportunity from those institutions to go to Cuba to both train and bring materials to archivists and librarians there, and while visiting had an opportunity to work with the very artists cooperative that she'll be talking about today, where she had a chance to bring some materials being the ever sought for quest of this group of artists, had a chance to bring materials and actually be present while they were producing some of their editions. So she has on-the-scene experience as well as a great deal of expertise with this collection. We're really thrilled that she is willing to bring the collection to you. There are materials on the table afterwards. You're welcome to come and take a look. As we always say, we'll be happy to show you anything you'd like to see. In the meantime, why don't you welcome Jeanne.
It's really my pleasure to be here, to be able to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, and that is the books of Ediciones Vigía. But you know, the books wouldn't be available if it was not for the amazing cataloging that is done by the Rare Book Cataloger, and it's Barbara Dash is the person. So if you look in the online catalog and just search under Ediciones Vigía, all of the books that are here in the Library of Congress collection are there. But it's not just that they're there, it's that she's done this amazing description to say when it's birdseed on the cover, or when it's coffee grounds, or when it's yarn, and so she describes it really, really well. So there's that to provide access, and then the other amazing thing here at the Library of Congress is the Conservation Division, and they're actually the people who have been responsible for making the housings for these books, because the paper itself is not good paper. I can't deacidify it for a whole bunch of reasons, so I can't stop the acid degradation in the paper, but by housing them appropriately, that goes a long way. So my title, Binding, Collections, Care, Mass Deacidification, it has nothing to do with these Cuban books. But as Mark said, I had this opportunity when I worked at Johns Hopkins back in 96, 96 was when I first started working there. And a gentleman came up to me, Franklin Knight, who was doing research in Cuba, and I had given this little 10-minute talk about freeze-drying water-damaged books. I was the beginning act for a much larger talk that was going on. And afterwards, he came up to me and he said, you know, I think that freezing of water-damaged paper would be really useful in Cuba. Would you go down to Cuba and tell them about that? And I said, well, sure. But you know, they've got to have steady electricity in order for it to really work, because if you freeze and thaw, that's really bad for the paper. So in fact, he used his connections and got me invited to speak at the National Archives there. Well, I knew the Americans who were also speaking there, so I contacted them and wound up going down to speak at that conference. In the meantime, I had been following book arts lists and saw this talk about these book artists in Cuba, and I thought, well, since I'm going to be there anyway, I should go down and see them. So I finagled a way to get to Matanzas. And let me show you. So here's Cuba. You can see where we are, Guantanamo Bay, in case anyone didn't know where that was. And there's Havana, up there on the left, just 90 miles from Key West. And then Matanzas, which is both a province and also a city. And it is in the city of Matanzas, sometimes called the Athens of Cuba. Called the Athens of Cuba because of the wonderful creative spirit that is in Matanzas. They have a fabulous old opera house. They used to do wonderful, wonderful opera performances there. I saw one there. So the Athens of Cuba, there to be creative. And they have this creative spirit that they needed to let out in this socialist country where publishing is controlled by the government. So here we are, just a few miles, just to kind of bring that home to you, how close we are to Cuba. And of course, Cuba used to be the place to go for fun and entertainment before Castro, before the revolution. Have to show you Ambos Mundos. That's the hotel, actually the first hotel that I stayed in when I was in Cuba. It's right in Old Town Havana. And Ambos Mundos is famous because Hemingway wrote Farewell to Arms there. And the room that is there, they took and turned just that one room into a museum. So you pay for your room a little bit higher to be on the floor where Hemingway was, but you get to go into his room. So I'm going to take just a minute to show you a little bit about Hemingway. So this is the Hemingway House that's down there in Cuba. I also visited there, and there are a number of projects, American projects actually, going on to help preserve the materials. Well, why? Because, of course, Hemingway is American, and although he lived in Cuba for many, many years, there is travel back and forth, has been travel back and forth between Cuba and the United States to visit this beautiful home of his, and also to work with his archives. So I gave you just one picture of the dining room there that's his home. And they have the table all set, and then they have his studio, and they have all of his typewriter and the pens that he liked, and all of those things are spread out. And so people are not allowed into the house anymore because, strangely, after a tour, little things would be missing from the top of the desk. And so what they did was they realized that they just didn't have the kind of security that they needed to guard all of those small pieces of Hemingway, and who wouldn't want to pick up a pen that Hemingway had used to write with? It's understandable, but wrong, of course. So they closed it up, and it's only open now with Dutch doors, so you can look in the windows and the Dutch doors, and only very small groups or people who work in preservation are allowed into the house. So we were just outside of Havana, and now we've gone into Matanzas. Here is the entranceway into the first floor of this wonderful old colonial home, right on it's called Watchtower, which is Vigía means watchtower. There's a Watchtower Square, and it's right off the Watchtower Square there in Matanzas. Matanzas is known not only as the Athens of Cuba, but also it is known for its sugar cane. So it has wonderful sugar cane, and there's a bay there, and so the slave ships used to come into Matanzas Bay and offload the slaves and pick up the sugar, and then go on to the United States. So there are lots and lots of slave registries actually that are there in the provincial archives in Matanzas. And what I did was I created work projects for the Johns Hopkins students. They would go to Cuba, still are going to Cuba, I believe, through Ford Foundation money originally, and they would go during the break in the semesters and go for a couple of weeks. And so Franklin Knight had started all of this, and so he invited me, and I said, you know, the students are learning at the University of Havana about what's happening in Cuba. Let's give them a hands-on project where they can actually do something to help take care of the collections that the Americans want to be able to use. So let's do something. And so many hands make light work, and we did projects, and the students thought it was a great idea. Why? Because Matanzas has the best beaches in all of Cuba. So what would happen is in the morning, we would work in the archives, housing slave registries, and in the afternoons, they would go to the beach, and I would go to Ediciones Vigía and work with the team of artists there, about a dozen people, and help them make their books. So I didn't just watch them, I worked with them. So I wanted to take this opportunity to be able to show you how these things come together. So you can see those banners hanging down, those are all for sale, and then they have some books there. We probably, here at the Library of Congress, we probably have all of those. As I look at them, I'm not sure. And here are the people who I first met at Vigía, and you can see me there in the background, and right in front of me is Erin Loftus, and she is hanging on closely to a package you can see in her hand there, and that is the Cigar Book, which are the book about tobacco, and there's a cigar book, and it's in a cigar box, and there's actually a real cigar there. And you see that big grin on her face, and you see that I am not smiling quite so much. She had purchased the last one of the cigar books, and so she was quite happy. Jan is right in front of her. She was working for Johns Hopkins magazine, and she wrote articles about me. So the four people, both beside me and then over to your right, are all working at Vigía. So what is Vigía? It is a book cooperative. It is a small press. It is an artist community. It is a gathering of literary and artistic people who come together to create. They do editions of 200, and they started in 1985. In 1985, there was a real shortage of paper in Cuba, and so they wanted to publish. They didn't want to be associated with the government publishing, and in fact, all publishing in Cuba at that time was controlled by the government. So what did they do? I always say if I can't go in the door, I'll go in a window. And that's exactly what these people were doing. So they got scrap paper, butcher paper, which we might think of as like craft paper. And they would get the butcher paper, and that's bagasse. It's made from the outer core of the sugarcane, and they have paper mills right there in Matanzas as well as the sugar mills. So they have the two mills right next to each other. They use the waste from the sugar then to make the paper. And so they would use that paper, and they borrowed a mimeograph machine. It was an old Russian one. And so they kind of borrow, beg, and steal. They didn't steal, but materials in order to be able to create and put down on paper their literary creations, because all of these people are all literary artists. They're poets, they're novelists, they're short story writers. They all have literary talent as well as the ability to put together, assemble books. And that's in fact what they do. They assemble them. So this is, and these are actually the slave registries. This is the before. These are some of the young Hopkins students who are working on rehousing. That was what we did in the afternoon. And there you can see they're all rewrapped in acid-free paper there in the provincial archives there. So you see how these people are smiling. So when I was buying books, so the books sell for, when I was there in the late 90s, early 2000s, you could use American dollars. You could either use, you could pay either in American dollars or in Cuban pesos. Didn't matter. Because there was so much U.S. dollars coming to Cuba from the Cubans who live in the United States and were sending money home, because life was really, really, it was called, the phrase was, it was the belt-tightening time in Cuba. This was after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was no longer supporting Cuba the way it had been. And so all of a sudden, you know, they lost all of these resources. And so as they made the books, that's how these people get paid. It's about a dozen people. And so they would sell their books. So once they knew that I had money, they'd say, Jeannie, come to my house, I can show you some things. And then I would go to their homes and they would pull things out from under their bed and they would have books there and I would buy their books and they would be able to get cash that way. And that was great. So the reason that Lara and Raul are smiling is because those were books that I had purchased and they had had a part of it. And so I said, oh, please won't you sign the book. And Lara was particularly pleased because the book that she is signing is actually, the artwork was done by her son, who was probably 10 at the time. Vigía mixes it up. You can have children's illustrations to a scholarly book. You can have the very best artists decorating the children's books. They mix it up. And so Lara, that was actually, that's a history of puppetry in Cuba. And the illustrations are by her son. So just want to give you a little sense of, this is a second floor workroom, and you see they have the long tables there, and so it is assembly line. What you have is you have a book that is the model that is created either by Rolando Esteves, had previously been the artistic director. He was a stage designer, and when that business dried up, he went with the books and started working with Vigía and actually helped to create it in 1985. So there's one model that is created, and then all of the materials are assembled, and what you do is you do assembly line work. So you do all of the same thing for all 200 of the edition, and then you go to the next step, and you do that all the way around, and then you do the next step. So silver half moons is what it was like, okay, that's what we're gluing on this afternoon. We're gluing on silver half moons, and we had the location of where they were supposed to go, and we were gluing them on. So they have their supplies there. They'll open up the shutters, and everybody sits along the table, and it was very interesting. So I had my own scissors, and I just left my scissors, we would take a break and go and eat something and then come back, and no one else left their scissors. Their scissors were like, I was like, what's up with the scissors, And they said, yeah, if we pay for scissors, we'll never get another pair of scissors, so we take care of our scissors. And I said, next time I come, I'll bring you scissors, which was in fact what I did. This is their like little memorial piece that they have that's there in the sales room that has pictures and different things that people have brought and left for them. So let's talk about that cigar book that made Aaron so darn happy. It's over here, and it's the history of tobacco in Cuba, and it has its very own cigar holder that's been made and glued together, and that one actually has a cigar in it. The one that Aaron got didn't have a cigar. So what are they writing about? They're writing about Cuba. They publish famous Cuban authors, but they also publish authors, well, lots of Soviet authors, but international authors. So when a wonderful, wonderful book on Edna St. Vincent Millay, the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Now at that time, she's kind of come back again, but back in the late 90s, who was reading Edna St. Vincent Millay? Very few people. Recently, there have been a couple of biographies about her that have put her back in the public's eye, and she's a wonderful poet. And then Emily Dickinson, and we have a book here. Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to do that. So we have a book on Emily Dickinson, and what they did was they made Emily Dickinson's house, and then there's a tree, and the tree compresses in the bottom, but it stands up. And the full kit comes with a rock that you put to hold the tree in place. So they think of everything. And the original, it all fits inside the house. And on the house, if you look at it in the front, you'll see a dog there. So it's Emily Dickinson's dog. So yes, it's in Spanish and in English. they did translation, or they got somebody to do translation. So Emily Dickinson. So just a wide, wide variety of poetry books. But the other thing about Vigía is that in their patio, they would also have readings. They originally started off just doing poetry readings, and then they started publishing those readings just in banners or on sheets, and then started putting them together. But they were always, always, always concerned about the children. And so they would have activities for the children, and then they started doing, they actually do a magazine for children, and they publish children's stories. And you'll see one over here. Pelosi is a famous children's character in Cuba, and there's a book there. And he's sitting on the porch there with his grandmother, with his little ukulele, and that's and then there are stories in that book about that you can look at in a little bit. I just, as I did these slides, but you know, it's just so much better to look at the books. But I can't go away from this microphone, or I'll get scolded. And so I'm stuck here, but the books are here. So actually, Jackie, will you bring up just a couple of them over here, and then you guys can look at them, and I can still stay tied to my mic the way I have to be. So this is a Revista. It's a quarterly that has been coming out since 1987, I believe, was the first one. This one is celebrating their 20th year. So can you see the matches that have been broken and used to be the hands of the clock? And then the back of it. So they've glued on, okay. So you see all these different colors. Each one of those was cut out and was glued on. We're talking a lot of work here. And then the way they did the lifted piece with the cardboard, and then, now if you look at this one, you can see it's like not mimeographed. This one is a computer generated. So they got a computer, actually was given to them from Spain. Some of their, they have colleagues in Spain, and they also do collaboration with them for publications. And then I, of course, would bring them material. So I brought them lots of colored paper. So this might be, because that would have been before, this came later. So maybe the paper was colored paper that I brought them. And I brought them paints, and I brought them scissors. But I brought them a whole variety of supplies that they could use. But if you look inside, but what I didn't do was try to teach them bookbinding. And you will see that they really need to know how to do bookbinding, because the books don't open. They're all stapled on the side, and when you do something that thick and staple it on the side, and of course they don't have a lot of paper, and so they're not going to give you a very good gutter margin, and so you really have to work to read the book.
What's the printing offset?
No, this is just computer printing, and originally it was mimeographed. The original ones, I think we've got some mimeographed ones as well, so you can see the difference of the very early ones and then the later computer ones. But notice the insides, which are really beautiful too, and that there's artwork that goes around all of the text. And Mark's holding up one that also, that's a mimeographed one, but again, there's artwork, there's design that goes around all the text.
And it's also stab sewn.
That one's a stab sewn, yeah. So none of them open up very easily. And they do double layers for the inside to make the paper heavier for the cover. So they're really using all of the available resources that they have. So they use dried leaves, they do use birdseed. There's a wonderful, wonderful one that the front cover is painted with dried coffee grounds. Fragile because the coffee grounds could come off. Why? Because they never have enough glue. The adhesive, they water down the adhesive and water down the adhesive, and I said, I'll bring you adhesive. I brought them adhesive, you know. And then they said to me the second time I was there, they say, you know, a lot of people come and buy books and say, oh, we'll come again and we'll bring you things. and they never do. So we didn't believe that you would. But I did, and I have. For a number of years, my daughter calls Cuba my second child. So the revistas come out quarterly. Sometimes they do a double one where they come out fewer times. Let's look at one of those old ones. Can you see that I'm attached to the mic? Yeah, that's a great one.
This is one with the leaves for trees.
So
It's
yes.
a little box.
So this one, it's got sand here, and it's got leaves to make the trees and and twigs, and then they often take fabric and scrunch it up, scraps of fabric. I brought them a lot of fabric as well, and this one, and then they have this Cecil cord. This is one that's been that's mimeographed, so it's an early one. And actually, this one doesn't have images around. It isn't framed with art, but the chapter headings or whatever, the dividers always have different colors in them. So we sit around and listen to music and cut and paste, and that's how these all get assembled. And then for their work, they get a certain number of the books. So I sat next to one of the best contemporary poets, and she was assembling. Why? Because it wasn't her book. So her job at that time, so it was, to my mind, it was the purest socialist organization that I met in Cuba. The archives, yeah, a lot of hierarchy there. It wasn't a common man for everyone being equal. Not true. But at Vigía, everyone was. So if you were the designer of the book, then that was your time to step out. But when you weren't the designer or you weren't the author, then you were an assembler. And it was all for the common good to create these beautiful creations, either for the children's books or for the adult books or for the magazines. Let's look at the two we have, so you can see this idea of what the two look like, where we're trying to assemble them so that they are all the same. So the objective,
Copy one, copy two.
so the objective of this, stand closer because I have to stay here. And they're not exactly alike. We have two of edition of 200, and I have some in my own personal collection where I have multiples, and you can see the differences in them. So he's a painter, and he's looking at his object of desire or object that he's painting, and they're each a little bit different. So see, the background paper is different, and you see. So that's what they had available to them, but the placement is as much alike as they can get it. So you look at where you're supposed to put your different pieces when you're assembling, and you make them look alike, as much alike as you can. And even here, the paper's different. That's a browner paper than this paper.
So what's the text page look like?
Well, the text pages, as you saw before, this one, the art has the artist, and then the model, and then parts of the artist's trade. But the other thing I want to show you is on the back of this one, and this is their logo. So their logo is a lantern, and their lanterns are always a little bit different. So here they've colored the lantern. You can see the red that they've colored. So everywhere on every book, on the back of it, you'll see a lantern in some guise or another, and they're different.
Hand painted with watercolor?
This would be or a felt tip pen perhaps. It depends upon what they've been able to get a hold of. But you can see this one's sewn too, and they use different yarn. I brought them a lot of yarn. I took them a lot of yarn. So I like to think maybe some of this yarn may have come from my mother's yarn box. Let's look at the Pelosi. Will you bring that one over?
This one?
Yes, just so that people can see that a little bit better, because they like to do pop-ups, and they often have what we call in library speak accompanying materials.
So if you hold it, I can open it.
Okay, so this
So
is,
there's the people.
so here's Pelosi, and he has this little roof as well. And so you can see they've put tissue paper, colored tissue paper, and they've glued all of that on. And you can see when you close it up, you can see that some of it's missing. It must be they didn't get quite enough glue. They watered it down a little bit too much. So they have movable parts, particularly for the children's books, but for others as well. But let's look at the back, and there's that lantern as an oil lamp lighting the way for the grandmother and Pelosi as she's reading to him. So that's a different way of seeing the lantern. Let's look at the one with the bark.
Okay. I'll bring up the whole box.
So one of the things that they do is use any material that is available to them. We talked about dried coffee grounds. This one,
We're going to leave it in the box.
yeah, this one has bark, and if you can see along here, that's the inner part of a corrugated cardboard. So what they do is they take the cardboard out into the patio and they water it down and leave it out in the sun for a while and then water it down a little bit more, and then they can pull the cover off, and now you can use the corrugate, which is much more interesting as a design piece. And that's what they've done for this one. And then they've also burnt it, as you can see, as part of again, part of the design part of it. And then glued on their pieces. So always multiple pieces. Let's look at the children's book with the banner. So I said accompanying materials. Oftentimes you just don't know. You start looking at one of the books, and inside there'll be a bookmark that they've created, that they've added in. Or they'll add a banner so that there'll be a single poem of one of the authors. So that's what we have here. This is one of the children's books. And this is one of my favorite children's books. It's just great. It's a castle, and you open it up, and then the book is inside, and the pages turn in there. Hold it up a little bit higher so everybody can see. Thank you. And then that tissue paper, and then they've glued on, so it's interactive, as they say with more. And there's a twig here that's holding the pet lizard and a string. That this kid has got the string for the lizard, and he's scaring the little girl. You can see the storyline there. And then let's look at the back of that one as well. So you can see the kids climbing over, and here they are, and there's the donkey, and they're riding away. And you can see I mean, it's full 3D, so that you can see all parts of the book. So, what's going to happen with Ediciones Vigía now that there are some changes in Cuba? Well, in fact, some changes have already happened there, because the success of Vigía, I mean, they had a great location on the way to Veradero, which is, as I was saying, the best beach. So you'd have tourist buses that would go from Havana. They'd stop in Matanzas for a little break, and then they go on to the beaches. And so they were very well placed to be able to sell their books to tourists, and they did. They're at the Guadalajara Book Fair, and we also, there are jobbers here in the United States. Carno Books is a company that we buy most of the books from here for the Library of Congress. Most of my books came from, I bought in Cuba, or a Cuban brought them back for me. But the government saw that they were being quite successful, and so the government wanted to get in on some of that benefit. And so it was in 2009 that the publishing part of the government went to Vigía and said, we want this to be part of the government now. And so Vigía, of course, can't say no exactly, but didn't really want to say yes because they wanted to control the editorial selection of who they're going to publish. And in fact, the way that that's done is by committee. Oh, did I say that I thought that they were pretty darn socialist and worked with that? That's how they pick the books that they're next going to publish. It's not a person who decides that. It's the whole group. And they have these discussions, sometimes heated, not surprisingly, about who they're going to publish. And then they decide, they do a vote, and then that's how they decide how they're going to move forward with the book, and who's going to be the editor, who's going to do the design, and then how it all comes together. And the rest of the people are assemblers, unless they're authors. They also do prizes in Cuba. So they award a prize, and the prize is that the new author who wins the prize gets their publication done by Vigía in an edition of 200. So they had really been ramping up what they were doing for publications. They also donate some of their books to the public libraries there, and one usually goes to the National Library as well as to the provincial library. So when the government saw all this, they wanted to be a part of it, and that is in fact what has happened with reservations. So they still control editorial decision-making, but I would posit that they're a little more careful about who they publish. But they get paper now, and they get other resources, and that's good and helpful. So I believe that they will continue on. Rolando Esteves, who started it in '85, left in 2013 to go out on his own. He does his own artwork now. Mostly, he was the stage designer that I mentioned. He does some wonderful, wonderful installations now and two-dimensional artwork. And I've been very fortunate to remain his friend. And so I'm able to purchase some of his artwork as well, which I have in my little apartment. So Augustina Ponce, who is an author and has also been with the Ediciones Vigía since '85, she remains the editorial manager. And I'm still in contact with her as well. So will it change when Cuba opens up? Probably it will. We have already seen, you've already seen the changes that have happened since '85 as they've gotten more technology. Now some people say to me, oh, I want to go to Cuba before it's ruined. And I say, what does that mean? And almost always it is, oh, I want to go there when it's still the way it is now with the old cars and I'm like, I get that, but don't you also want to let the Cuban people have the opportunities that we in the United States have? And, oh, if you think that just because we have our own embargo in Cuba, that is worldwide, think again. There are lots and lots of tourists who go to Cuba. There are Italians who build hotels in old Havana, in the newer parts of Havana. There are, the Spaniards are fabulous about helping with renovation projects. So Cuba, we're isolated from Cuba. But Cuba's not isolated from the rest of the world. Now why? Of course, they're further away. And so it costs more to ship things from Spain to Cuba than it would cost if we shipped things from the United States. But Cuba is open in many, many different ways. And for those of you who have visited Cuba, you see that there are changes. I've seen changes that are happening just in terms of the renovation that's going on there. I haven't been back to Cuba since I started working at the Library of Congress because as a Fed, I'm not supposed to go, well, particularly since they're a terrorist country. But I'm very hopeful now that that's all changing and we're reestablishing a relationship that I will be able to go again. And I'm looking forward to doing that. And to seeing and to working with the Vigía people and seeing what changes they want to bring to their publishing program. So I think unless I'm open to questions, I think I'll close on that note, and then we can look at the books a little more closely. Yes.
Yes, are any of the book makers here puppet makers? Is there any overlap?
Are they puppet makers? I don't know the answer to that, but because there's so much puppetry in Cuba, I wouldn't be at all surprised. And I do know that Rolando did a stage production of puppets. But these are just 12 people. There are just so many very talented, expert people in Cuba that the puppeteers are elsewhere. Yeah?
I want to ask you, is the library doing any kind of projects with the Cuban library, or?
Well, no, not right now, but there are lots of projects that are going on. When I worked with the universities, I wrote grants to go and work with the libraries and the archives. And I took conservators down to Cuba, and we shared our processes, if you will, and I brought them materials. I sent probably maybe $500,000 worth of supplies down there, but through Canada.
Okay. Well, because I was just down there about a month ago.
Oh,
and I
uh-huh.
went to their library, and
At the
the Marti. I
mhm.
invited myself, and I was given a 3-hour tour anywhere I wanted to go, and I met their director and 2 assistant
And he's,
directors.
yeah, wonderful.
And they're really in desperate shape.
They are. I did one workshop there at the National Library.
To give one example, and this just covers everything, is like this: their sound and recording room is using Soviet record players,
Right.
LPs. I mean, that is where their collections have basically stopped from that period, and they have a big Russian room because the Soviets had donated.
Sure.
But that hasn't been updated, since the special period.
And I did I did organize donations of books to go down to Cuba, and it was, but I put restrictions on what I would send down there. They are an island, and so I didn't want to send trash down there.
Right. Well, I took a bunch of books and magazines, just as a gift, but it's really
They probably
a shame
appreciated that. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
they love my New Yorkers for sure.
But they're just in such a bad shape. It's really too bad the library can't do something with them, because a lot of stuff we get rid of, they would happily take, because
And-
they're just, so antiquated.
And that is something that I believe will change over time as we open up with them.
There are some projects through IFLA that help solve the
There-
American problem.
That's right. If you go through there are different organizations that allow you to do that. And IFLA, of course, IFLA was in Cuba, and that was before my time. Before my time with IFLA.
Yeah. And at one point, the director of IFLA was the Cuban librarian.
Was a Cuban librarian, that's right. So IFLA is the International Federation of Library Associations, and they work internationally, and so they do work for Cuba. There are also AIC, which is the American Institute for Conservation, funds Cubans to come to the United States, and I've been able to help facilitate some of that sometimes. So there is exchange, but
Can't be very much.
there isn't a lot, no, and they are in desperate need. I worked with he was the conservator at the University of Havana Library, and they did not want to show me the lab there, and I sweet-talked my way in, and this wonderful gentleman, elderly gentleman who worked there, and for book presses he had cigar presses, and he was watering down his adhesive, and he was using what paper he could come up with to repair the books, to put them back, because the students use the library heavily. And he had this jar that was about 1/3 full of methyl cellulose, which is used for repairing paper. And I said, "Oh, when do you use that?" Because I was learning about I was just asking questions about his process. And he said, "Oh, I only use that on the most rare, special books, because I don't know when I will ever be able to get another jar of this again." And I said, when I make a promise and I handshake, it means that I'm good for the promise. I said, "I promise you I will bring you methyl cellulose." And so, in fact, I did, bring him that, and it was one of the workshops that I had for the provincial libraries around, and he was invited as well. And so I called him out. I said, you know, the reason that we're having this workshop is because of this gentleman, because of what he was willing to open up and show me of the lab and what the value of exchanging ideas might be.
Yeah, they're pretty open now with a lot of things like that, and they admit that they need a lot of help. And so,
But they're also a very proud and generous. When one of my colleagues was that I was traveling with got a sinus infection, we took her to the emergency room and then got the prescription. But how are we going to fill the prescription? And we were staying at a convent, and converted convent, and I went to the night clerk and I said, I don't know how to get this filled, but she really needs this medicine because she needed to fly home in a couple of days. So sinus infection, you know, really serious. So she said, I'll take care of it. She went and she got the prescription filled that evening, woke up her son and got him to go and get it filled at some all-night pharmacy somewhere, and would not take any money for it. Would not take any money for it. They're very, very generous people, but they share with each other. They help each other out, and that comes from that in the condition of need that they're in. I suppose that not everyone would do that. And so I found them extremely welcoming and very, with Vigía, very, very easy to work with. They allowed me to be a part of the Scissor Brigade. So, any other questions? Yeah?
You specifically mentioned not teaching them how to bind books.
Well, when I went down there, I went down to bring them the papers that they needed, but it's not my place to tell them how to do it better. I think that the ugly American is the one who comes in and says, let me show you how to do it right. And that's not who I am. If they had asked me about bindings, or if and in fact I've shown them some of my own bindings, and they're interested in that, and they in fact have changed somewhat, but they don't have resources to be able to do anything other than to print to the size and then staple it together. They don't have adhesive. I mean, they can't do adhesive binding. They don't have the resources for that. So side stapling is pretty much all they can do, or the side stitching. And that has to do with the size of paper that they can use, the size of cutters that they have, all of that. So while I could teach them, their books would have to be a whole lot smaller. And so then they'd be thicker, and then, you know. So certainly in the archives and the libraries where I was teaching conservation skills, that was something different. But with Vigía, I didn't feel it was my place to do that. Instead, what I asked them was for them to share with me their process, and they very willingly did that.
Why don't we thank Jeannie and...
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.